So what is this puzzle of educated unemployment? It's joint work with Romuald, who's at Oxford University, and he's really cool. He's kind of the European and I'm the African, right? It's like time-wise. So yeah, he's like great co-author. So what are we talking about? Now, it's a well-known fact that unemployment decreases in education in most developed countries. That's actually like the first sentence of Mintz's famous 1991 NBR working paper, where he says it's a well-known fact that, well, it turns out that unemployment is increasing with education in many developing countries. And what do I mean by that? Well, increasing or at least hump-shaped in education in many developing countries. What have we got up there? The x-axis, log GDP per capita, so a measure of the income level of a country. On the x-axis, I've plotted the ratio of basic unemployment rates minus the unemployment rates of people with intermediate education. That's here on the left-hand side. And then on the right-hand side, people with advanced education. What means intermediate education means like at least an upper secondary schooling degree. Advanced education would mean tertiary education. What can we see? Well, we see that I've plotted here the number one. That means they would have the same unemployment rates. Numbers above means that people with less educated, or let's just say with low education, have higher unemployment rates than people with more education. And numbers below one mean that people with more education tend to have higher unemployment rates than people with basic education. And so for many developing countries, so while it's true in developed countries, it's indeed true that people with more education, they tend to have lower unemployment rates. This is not true for for low income countries. And it's not just West Africa, but it's actually holds for plenty of countries. And that fact is something that we find striking, and we want to understand where is it coming from. Now, kind of on the one hand, that's just a fact, right? It could just be optimal, basically, to do it that way. Now, what is kind of a special feature of labor markets in developing countries is that there's self-employment is very widespread. So that raises the question, why don't these people at least downgrade temporarily into self-employment until they can find the kind of job that they're aspiring to? Now, there's different reasons that we could think of why this pattern is happening. It could be, or definitely it's true that labor markets are frictional. I just don't go out there and I want to have a job and I get it. There's a role of the public sector. I have a lovely picture of that one a few slides down the road. So oftentimes good jobs in developing countries are located in the public sector. Public sector is not just hiring anyone, they're actually paying higher wages, they're giving permanent positions out there. And so these jobs are very attractive. So people might just want to queue up for these types of jobs. And then also, who gets education in a developing country in the first place? Well, it's the privileged. So it's also the ones who can afford to wait in unemployment. So there are all different kinds of possible mechanisms or reasons that could generate this educated unemployment puzzle. And in our paper, we'll try to say more about what could be the role of different of these possible mechanisms. Now, I realize that, structural people that might not care about why should we care? If I try to sell this to development class, they're asking me, why should I care? Well, it's a huge policy concern. Like in West Africa, they're putting up all these policies, public policies. They think that employment is the number one factor that they need to tackle as a government. They even say so. L'emploi, c'est le boulot du gouvernement. Creating jobs is the job of the government. And so basically, policy-wise, there's lots of scope of what you want to do. And in this paper, we try to understand what would be good ideas to do and what would be less good ideas to do. So we're tackling three questions in this paper. The first one is that we want to understand just very simply why are educated workers more likely to be unemployed than less educated workers. So which of the different sources of this could be driving that pattern. The second one is how much or is the public sector contributing to it and how much. And then the last one, which types of labor market policies could be effective at reducing educated unemployment and which types of policies might make things worse. We're going to study these questions in the West African context. Let me now show you the picture. You're going to love that. For all those of you getting up tomorrow no, it's not tomorrow, it's on Sunday, 2 a.m. in the morning to see the final. This is the football stadium in Senegal, in Dakar, in 2012. That was not, I repeat, this was not after or before a big football match. This picture was taken after the government had announced to create 4,000 public sector jobs. Unfortunately, there were so many men and women who wanted to get these 4,000 jobs that they had to open the largest stadium so that they could take people there to get them to hand in their applications. There were 120,000 applications for these 4,000 jobs. So this is just showing the public sector probably has a role to play in this educated unemployment puzzle. So what we're doing in this paper is we're developing and estimating a search and matching model. And this matching model, search and matching model, has two key characteristics. First of all, it has heterogeneous workers, obviously. So we're going to have workers who differ in their educational level and their parental background. So 2 dimensions of heterogeneity. And then on the labor demand side, we're going to have multiple labor market sectors. So we're going to have a public sector, we're going to have firms, and we'll have self-employment. And we'll see that the interaction of these two is really important. Maybe just very briefly, what do these different sectors look like? On the left-hand side, we have different education levels from no education to tertiary. We see the share working in different sectors. So clearly people with little education, they tend to be mostly self-employed, whereas people with tertiary education, they tend to be mainly in the public sector and the private sector, but some of them still end up being self-employed. On the right-hand side, I've plotted residual wage distributions for the 3 sectors after controlling for country fixed effects and education levels. And so we can see that the public sector tends to pay something of a premium, right? So it's not huge, but like the orange distribution is shifted slightly to the left compared to the 2 other ones. And so these are potentially factors that make why people might want to wait until they can get these coveted public sector jobs. So when we talk about, I'm going to talk about public sector distortions. What I have in mind is kind of different types of distortions. So one distortion could just be that the public sector is offering higher wages. Okay, and so that means that people, if they can't search on the job, they might want to delay, they might want to stay in unemployment until they can get these better jobs. The second kind of type of distortion is that the public sector could have a minimum wage rule. So again, that would drive up wages in the public sector and make it more attractive to go into the public sector. The second type of distortion that we're going to look at is vacancies. So how many jobs is the public sector putting out, and how is that in equilibrium going to affect the postings that the private sector is going to make? Because these 2 sectors are very much competing for workers, for skilled workers. And so when we think about distortions, it's kind of this wage distortion on the one hand, and the other hand is kind of the quantity of vacancies out there that might crowd out the private sector. And then the third thing that we'll do, and I think that's the most exciting part, is when we look at labor market policies. And in particular, we're going to look at labor market policies that resemble something that's very closely was either proposed by these governments or that have even been implemented. And so we'll find ways in our model to say, what would that correspond to? And then we'll look at the effects in equilibrium. So for example, if this public sector suddenly goes out and decides to announce another 10% of vacancies, how is that going to feed into vacancies posted by the private sector? How is that going to reshuffle workers across the different sectors? Who is going to be pushed maybe into unemployment or maybe not? And what is that going to do to wages in equilibrium and then welfare? What we're doing here in terms of related literature, maybe let me just say 2 words about that. This education and unemployment puzzle has not been talked about a lot. So this is something relatively new. And there's some earlier studies talking about it within migration. So it could just be that people hope to migrate, so they get more education and eventually they'll move up. In this case, in West Africa, migration is not really a big thing. If anything, migration happens between these countries. A newer idea that has come into is more skill-based technological change. That's like one possible mechanism. What we try to do here is be very agnostic about the type of mechanism that could be, and then we'll let the data speak to say what is actually the mechanism that's driving our results, and then that's going to have implications for which policy might be effective and which ones are not. The new contribution is really bringing these 3 labor market sectors, something that hasn't been done up to now, with heterogeneous workers. And that's going to create a lovely sorting of workers into different sectors, so workers into unemployment, etc. And that kind of is also the nice part about the policy simulations, that suddenly we see the private sector is kind of crushed between self-employment and public sector. And so there are important spillovers. If you do one thing on one end, it has kind of trickle-down effects onto the other sectors. So I just want to give you a model sketch, because like if you want to know more, I'm happy to show you in the appendix like what the equations and all of that looks like. And then I'm briefly going to talk about data estimation. Estimation is not where we contribute like much. Briefly about the results, and then mostly about the policy simulations. So the framework is a search and matching model. On the labor demand, I've already said that before. We have 3 sectors. A private, from now onwards, think of it as formal sector. So this is not like Latin America, where all jobs are salaried jobs, or most jobs are salaried jobs, but some of them are informal, some of them are formal. In West Africa, like jobs in the private sector are often formal jobs, and you have like salaried jobs. On the other hand, we have self-employment, and we don't call it informal, because actually the informal sector in our case is almost always self-employment. So it's people having ideas and deciding to sell strawberries on the road. Okay, so that's kind of the type of self-employment. So workers are entrepreneurs, if you want. And then kind of the third type of sector is that we're going to have an exogenous public sector. So exogenous in the sense the public sector decides on the wages it wants to offer, it decides on the vacancies it wants to create, and that has ripple through effects through the rest of the economy. And then on the workers' side, heterogeneous workers, they depend, they're characterized by Y, where Y is the 2-dimensional, on the one hand, the education level, and on the other hand, the parental background. So you can think of whether your own parent has worked in the formal sector, so in the public sector or the private sector, that might be that they then have more means to support you while you're in unemployment. And it also means that they might be door openers for you to get jobs in these lucrative sectors. Search is random and costless for workers. It's not directed. And that is actually also consistent with what we see in the data, this imperfect sorting, but also that people actually indeed in the survey say, I don't target any sector in particular. They get jobs at the rate lambda J, where J stands for one of the 3 sectors. And this lambda J can depend on their parental background for public or private sector jobs. And then when they get an offer, they decide whether they want to accept that offer or not. So the decision rule here is going to be very simple. It's going to be a reservation wage for each of the 3 sectors. And if the job offer wage is, the wage offered is above that, they're going to accept it. If it's below, they're going to reject and they'll continue searching. So these RJYs are going to differ by the heterogeneous workers and by sector. And that's going to give us the sorting into the different sectors. And then finally, what we do is that we have this assumption that workers only continue to search if they are self-employed. It's really these public sector and private sector jobs, they're really good. They're often almost permanent. And so there's not that much change once you've landed one of these good jobs. So the only thing where you kind of want to continue possibly to search is when you're self-employed, you have low wages. And so you still hope kind of to go into the public or the private sector. So in terms of a sketch, we have people in unemployment. They get a flow value of unemployment of BY. So it depends on their education and their parental background, how costly they find being in unemployment. They get, with different rates, they get offers from the public sector, from the private sector, or they have a business idea that they come up with. If they decide to accept that offer, they're going to get the associated public wage. So that would be WJ, J for government, Y. If they decide to get the formal job, they're going to, XP is basically the productivity, the match surplus, or the match between the firm and the worker. And so they're going to split that match. And the way they're going to split is going to depend on the outside option of the worker. So the better the outside option, the more of the surplus the worker can capture. And if you're self-employed, you just basically get whatever idea you've had, the product of your work goes right away into your pocket. If you're self-employed, you can continue to get public sector and formal wage offers, though possibly at a lower rate. So the lambda would be multiplied by a factor psi, and psi, if it's 0, it means self-employment is an absorbing state. If psi is equal to 1, there's no difference between searching between unemployment and self-employment. And if it's somewhere between, it means there's like lower rate of offers. And then in all of these jobs, you get laid off with a certain rate delta. And this delta depends on the sector and it depends on the education level. And you're back into unemployment. That's kind of what's happening on the workers' side. I'm not sure if I should show you. Anyways, well, Ali, you have a question?
Family background, or does it also depend on the education?
No, it doesn't depend. So ex ante is the rate at which offers arrive. And because we assume random search, it doesn't depend on your education level. Ex post, it does, right? Because they have different reservation productive wages. And so certain people might turn down more. So say you're like high parental background, you might get the same rate of offers from self-employment as I do, but because you're a high parental background, I'm low, you're going to all turn them down, whereas I will accept them. Okay. So the value of being in unemployment depends basically on how costly you find unemployment, which depends on your background characteristics. With a certain rate lambda P, you get an offer from the private sector, and then the continuation value if you go into the government job, and then finally self-employment. And then that's where the choice really is happening. So it's really getting these reservation wages for each of the 3 sectors. And then we can also write basically the value of being employed in all of the other states. But let's just skip that. That's relatively trivial. So let's now move to the labor demand side. So the private sector firms, that's pretty much like Mortis and Pissarides framework. So endogenous vacancy creation. And what they're going to do is they're going to Nash bargain over wages. So XP is the productivity when a worker and the firm meet. They realize what the match value is. And then the worker, basically beta is the bargaining power of the worker. And so they're going to share that surplus. And then RVU is the outside option of the worker. And so the higher the outside option of the worker, the more surplus, the higher the wage is going to be. And also the higher the productivity, the higher the wage. And then basically these distributions, these underlying productivity distributions or wage distributions is something we're going to estimate for the different parental backgrounds. What does the firm's problem look like? The firm has a certain value of a worker coming from unemployment. So there's a match productivity X, they have to pay a certain wage. Is with a certain rate, these jobs get destroyed. And then if the worker instead comes from self-employment, the worker is going to bargain a different wage because they might have a better outside option. And therefore, the value of, or the wage that this worker can command is a different one. And the way what the firm is deciding is, oh, this is a bit confusing. V now is the value of posting a vacancy. That's going to depend on, in equilibrium, basically what are the type of searches that we have out there. So what is the composition of the unemployment pool? How likely is it to meet someone from unemployment? And what is the composition of the self-employment pool? And how likely is it to meet someone from there? So it's really like integrating over the different parental background and education levels among the two different sources of potential workers. So moving on to the public sector, I think I said most of that already before. They have a fixed numbers of vacancies that they post. The public wage has to be such that it's always above a certain minimum wage. The minimum wage is something that the public sector can control. What it means in practice is that someone wants to work in the public sector, they meet with the public sector, they draw from the wage distribution, and they're only going to get together, and the worker is only going to get employed if the worker's reservation, the wage it can command is at least as high as the worker's reservation wage. That's the first condition. And the second one is only if the resulting wage is higher than the minimum wage. So basically what the government only wants to hire workers that have a productivity, if you want to call it that way, that lies above the set minimum wage. These two sectors, they're going to post vacancies, and they will match with workers. And the rate at which matches are going to be formed depends on the vacancies posted by the private sectors, the vacancies posted by the public sector on the one hand, and then on the other hand, I is basically this measure of unemployed workers with different parental backgrounds and self-employed workers with different parental backgrounds. So you can think of this I as the effective number of searchers. Okay. Now, what is going to happen is that if there are more vacancies, like matches are going to go up. But what it also means is that the public sector and the private sector, they're competing for the same workers. So if the public sector starts to post more vacancies, it's going to make it harder for the private sector to fill its vacancies, and the other way around. And then self-employment is really just, you come up with an idea. With Lambda S, you have ideas, business ideas. The way we think about business ideas, that's maybe important to say, is with a positive income, okay? Now, there's an infinite amount of possibility, at least in West Africa, of how not to make money, okay? These ways are always open, like selling strawberries on the street. But there's kind of these lucrative self-employment opportunities, they are not always available. And so that's why this Lambda S is actually not infinity, because that would be, it's always a fallback option, but this Lambda S is something that we're going to estimate. And the rest of that, I already said. Psi here is basically if you're self-employed, that's kind of the efficiency when you're searching while self-employed. So if it's 1, there's no difference between searching between unemployment and self-employment. If it's 0, you can't search when you're self-employed. And if it's somewhere in between, you can still get these offers, but not. Then there's the trade-off between unemployment versus self-employment. So how can we solve the model? There are like different steps. We'll solve the workers' problem. That's going to give us the reservation productivity. We can solve the firm's problem. That's going to tell us how many vacancies they're going to create. And then we have like these conditions on the public sector, that the public sector is only hiring if the wage that they've drawn from the distribution is above the minimum wage rule. And then the match actually only happens if both want to do it, right? The worker wants to work for that wage and the public sector wants to hire the worker. Now, from now onwards, everything is going to be in steady state. So in steady state, what we have is the number of workers coming into, for example, unemployment has to be the same number of workers going out of unemployment. So we have like for every type of worker, we're going to have the 4 unemployment plus the 3 sectors. We have this kind of 4 steady state conditions. And then obviously the composition needs to be stable as well. So times, you know, the, 10 degrees or the 10 kind of possible discrete types of workers. And in equilibrium, this is where you can see I'm not like the best macroeconomist ever. I'm not a macro person. They would have like the lovely definition of the equilibrium, right? The equilibrium is going to be a set of reservation productivities for each of the three sectors for the white types of workers, and the offer arrival rate. Actually, the offer arrival rate is going to be determined by the labor market tightness, which is the number of effective searches per vacancies, and the share of vacancies posted by the private sector, which then solves the workers' problems, the firm's problems, satisfies number three, like the public sector conditions, and is in steady state. Okay, that's the equilibrium. Let me maybe show you, I have like maybe a little bit of time, what the reservation productivity. So the reservation productivity, we can basically solve for that one. The interesting one is the reservation wage. I call these two reservation productivity, reservation wage interchangeably, because at that point, they're the same, right? So if at the point of indifference, the firm is indifferent between hiring the worker and not, that means the productivity, what the worker is going to produce, is the same as the wage they have to give them. And so it's the same. So the reservation wage for the private sector is going to depend on how costly it is for the worker to be unemployed. B is going to be negative numbers. And then it depends kind of on the value of losing the job. And then, the expected value of going into the private sector, the expected value of going into government jobs, and the expected value of going into self-employment. And that's going to give us this reservation productivity. And this reservation productivity is really going to be key, or the reservation wage, because when we have policies, that one is going to change, right? People, if there's suddenly more public sector jobs, they might become pickier, and therefore they will increase the reservation wage. So now the private firms also have to offer a higher wage for these people to move into the private sector. So data and estimation. I have like 10 minutes left. So we're using data on West African urban areas. So we're only talking about urban areas, because in rural areas, people are mostly subsistence farming, and there's little interest to stay in rural areas when you have education. It's a cross-sectional household labor force survey that was done a few years ago, and it has two key features which are like aren't seen in West African data. The first one is that we have self-employment income. Like, go and find me a survey that has that one in here, and I'm gonna like piss you, because we've been looking for that, like for better data, and it's just not out there. So this is really cool. The second one is labor market transitions. So even though it's a cross-section, they're asked about previous spells and for how long they've been in the current employment sector, and that allows us to generate even, it's not the perfect measure of labor market transitions, but at least we can kind of look at some transitions across sectors, which is important. Identification and estimation. So everything in steady state equilibrium, we're going to estimate it by a simulated method of moments. We have 46 parameters that we're targeting. That we're estimating. We're targeting 260 moments. Kind of the key part is that we observe the distribution. Oh, this is now, I don't want to look at Bob. No, there's no unobserved heterogeneity in here. It's all observed. We know the types, right? The education and the low versus high parental background. And then we're making some assumptions about the wage offer distribution. So that's going to be log normal distribution. So we're just estimating the location and the scale parameter there. We're going to estimate the reservation wage, the minimum wage rule, then some efficiency in self-employment. And when you're with high parental background, the job arrival rates, destruction rates, and then we have to fix the bargaining power, matching efficiency, matching elasticity, and the last one, interest rate. Okay, because our model with the data, we can't identify them. And then we target kind of trimmed wage distributions, the lowest percentile of the wage distribution to get at the reservation wage, worker distribution across sectors, employment durations, and transition rates. And that makes up for a lovely estimation. So don't go ahead with an idea of changing it because it takes months to come back with the result. Fit is good. I realize you guys love like to have like 10,000 goodness of fit results. I've only put 2 here because I really care about the unemployment rates. On the right-hand side, people with low parental background, you see, we nail it. This one here is for those with high parental background. We don't quite nail it, in particular for those with no education, but who have a high parental background. Like it's still within the confidence interval, but it's kind of a bit too low. And the reason is we have very few observations here, right? These are weird people. Like who has like a parent working in the public sector and doesn't even manage to get like primary education? Like you're just, yeah. So that's what's happening. The rest of the model, like the fit is also pretty good. So we're happy with that. In terms of the parameters, like how can I summarize it? High frictions in the labor market, which means that the job arrival rates are low. Okay, I don't know if you're familiar with US numbers. Here, people on average get like 1/5 of a self-employment offer per year, and around the same of a formal offer. And so that formal offer then can be either from the public sector or the private sector. So very low job arrival rates, okay? So they have to wait a long time even to get any job offers. There's high inefficiency in public hiring. The public minimum wage is binding, at least for like all the lower education levels. So people would want to work in the public sector even for a much lower wage than what the minimum wage currently is, which means that the public sector is meeting a lot of people that would want to work there, and they're saying, oh no, your match is actually not good enough, and so they go on searching. So high inefficiencies there. There's differential destruction. Let's just skip that because I don't have a lot of time. Now, one thing, we're estimating the model only for Burkina Faso and Senegal. Burkina Faso is like really low income country. Senegal is like lower middle income country. And so we wanted to see, are there any stark differences between the two countries? It turns out they're pretty similar. The big difference is that Senegal is more developed and it has a more developed private sector. And so the private sector there is more resilient and has slightly lower frictions. But apart from that, they're like, otherwise there's like not stark differences between the two countries. I would have a slide on public sector distortions and what is really driving that, but let's just skip that and instead look at the policy simulations because that's where some of the nice stuff is coming from. So we're going to look at 3, I call them popular labor market policies. I'm not sure if that's the best way to call it. First one is these governments all said, let's go and create jobs, and that's what they did. Okay, so public vacancy creation is going to be the first one we'll look at. The second one is that they realized that the private sector is not hiring as much, and so they tried to lower the cost for the private sector to hire workers. And they did that in different ways. They did it by creating like employment agencies where private sector firms could meet potential workers, so to increase kind of matching. And on the other hand, one can also think of it just lowering the cost of posting vacancies. Now, you might not be familiar with that, but in development, there's a nice paper by Junkov a few years ago, and the World Bank is now tracking that. What is the cost of creating a formal business in developing countries? And you'd be surprised, it's super quick and super cheap in the US, and it's very long and very expensive in developing countries. So the way you can think about is if we could reduce that cost of formal businesses, like what would that do to them hiring more workers? And the last one is just a simple, let's give self-employed worker kind of like a wage subsidy. What happens then? We're going to compare the effects of these 3 different policies on the labor market equilibrium. So we'll look at unemployment just overall, and then very specifically educated unemployment. The way we're defining educated unemployment is going to be excess unemployment. So UH is the unemployment rate of education category H. And so this one here is the baseline. So those without any education. And so whenever the unemployment rate of educated workers is higher, it's going to contribute to educated unemployment. And if it's flat or decreasing, it wouldn't contribute. So we would not call, like in Western countries, there's not educated unemployment because unemployment rates are decreasing in education. We can also look at sectoral shares and workers' welfare. Workers' welfare is insofar important because unemployment, you can think of it, public sector is creating more jobs. Now, this means that more people are potentially going to wait longer to get these jobs. But if the wages are so high, it could actually still improve their welfare. So we want to make sure that on the one hand, we can talk about unemployment. What we really want to care is, are these workers in the end, once we look at how much goes into their pocket, are they really worse off? And so we also look at welfare. What we want is that these three policies are very different. So we want to compare them by looking at their costs. And the way we do that is we compute the value of the public wage bill. This would be the public wage bill beforehand. And then after these policies, we're again going to compute the public wage bill. And so now the share of workers in the public sector might be larger or smaller, depending on the policy we did. But then we're also going to compute the policy related cost. So in the first one, the public vacancy creation, it's just comparing the public wage bill before and after. But for policy 2 and 3, there's going to be the subsidy to the vacancy creation or the wage subsidy to self-employment income. And so we're also going to kind of measure that one, how big it is. And so we can then put all the policies and compare them for equal cost. And this is kind of this growth in expenditures. So how to read that graph? 0 means the current government expenditures. This one is increasing government expenditures up to 30%. This is decreasing. Blue is how much we could change additional vacancies for, say, 10% increase in government budget. It turns out that we can increase around 10% additional vacancies. If we have 10% increase in government expenditures, we can give a wage subsidy of around 5% to self-employed people. And if we increase government expenditures by 10%, we can actually subsidize vacancy postings in the private sector by 35%. And nicely enough, you can see that there's actually having less budget. When you start subsidizing vacancy postings in the private sector, initially your government expenditures decreases. And that's because the private sector is going to expand, and that expansion is going to cost you less than you gain in the contraction of the public sector. So really, it's this idea that these two sectors are competing for the same workers. So if we look at these three policies, always now on the x-axis is the growth in expenditures. What do they look like in terms of unemployment? What's happening to unemployment? Well, both the public vacancy posting policy and the self-employment subsidy are both increasing unemployment a little bit. It's positive numbers. So the line here would be everything above is an increase in unemployment. Vacancy postings in the private sector, that would lower unemployment. So clearly, like just looking at unemployment, this last policy of subsidizing the private sector would be the preferred one. If we look at educated unemployment, it's actually a very similar picture. So it's not that unemployment shifts kind of weirdly so that certain groups benefit. It's really this, same picture there. So if we only cared about educated unemployment, we would want to use 10% additional funds, and we would want to subsidize the private sector to create more jobs. We could look at the public sector and the private sector. What are the shares? How do they move in response to these policies? Let's just skip that. And so last thing, let's look at workers' welfare. So workers' welfare is really going to be like taking the average kind of value of being unemployed and then the share of being unemployed and the value of being employed. So that's going to depend on the wage across the different types of workers. And what we can see when we look at welfare, this is overall welfare. So across all workers, the policy of subsidizing the private sector and the policy of subsidizing self-employment are both welfare improving, whereas the public sector vacancy posting is welfare decreasing. Which policy is better? Well, these indirect labor market policies, which are not directly creating public sector jobs, they are better for worker welfare. And the one which is really best even to lower unemployment is stimulating the private sector. Why is the public sector vacancy creation not good? It's because there's a congestion externality. So if the public sector starts to expand, for every additional vacancy it creates, the private sector is going to cut more than one vacancy, because the public sector is going to cream skim the labor market. And so therefore the pool of workers left is going to be worse. And therefore the private sector says, no, we're going to hire fewer workers. And so all in all, it turns out that while all three policies were thought to improve welfare for these people, it is clearly the case that like doing more stuff for the private sector should be the way to go. Whereas kind of the two other policies, they might either be very costly and have little impact, or they might be very costly and actually have detrimental effects, at least for the worker. Thank you. I think I can conclude here. Happy to take like one or two questions if there's time. Yeah. Oh. So I'm not aware that there's a big garment industry in West Africa. It would be, so what we classify as public sector is government and government-owned government-owned firms. Okay, we both lump that together as the public sector. And yeah. I'm not sure, like this is highly debatable, but I wouldn't say that the public sector is profit maximizing. I think what, if anything, what they're doing is that they're maximizing the benefits that go to their clan or to their friends, etc. So I don't think they're really profit maximizing in that sense. So the firms, yes, they're profit maximizing. They're basically hiring workers up to the point where the marginal vacancy posted is equal to 0, because up to that point, new firms are going to enter the market and create additional vacancies. So the firms, yes, the public sector, we're very agnostic about what it does. We're just taking the wage distribution and the vacancies is given, but we think of that as policy tools that we can look at what would happen if they change that, and we can look at how does that going to affect the rest of the labor market equilibrium. Yeah. Well, remember that the reservation wage of the worker is where the worker is indifferent between working for the public sector or any sector for that matter and being in unemployment. So it's that indifference point. So at the indifference point, they don't care what they are. Now, what you're saying is kind of, we can't identify these additional benefits. Yes, they are there, but we can't, because what is binding is the high minimum wage, right? So what you're saying would drive up possibly, or would possibly even lower the workers' reservation wage further, because there are these additional benefits, but there's no way we can identify that, because it's not the reservation wage of the worker that's binding, but it's the public minimum wage that's binding. So unfortunately, we just can't identify that. In developed countries, oftentimes the government is paying less than the private sector, and then we can basically back out these amenities as the wage differential. Like, why are the public sector workers ready to go in the public sector? It's because of all these other perks. But if the public sector is paying more, there's no way of knowing kind of that additional one. But maybe we should chat afterwards more about that. Maybe you have some ideas of how we could do it that I haven't seen yet. Did you have a question? No, I think I should end, right?